This week, we will be discussing how virtue ethics can help us cultivate habits that will help us respond to the human condition. What is the human condition? Quite simply, it involves all the experiences of being human: birth, love, children, happiness. In this class, we haven't focused as much on those more positive aspects of the human experience. We focused more on suffering, trauma, and mortality. So, what we're saying in this presentation is that virtue ethics can help us respond to the more painful aspects of what it means to be human. The idea of virtue ethics predates Aristotle, but he was the one to really develop it in Nicomachean Ethics. In this text, Aristotle distinguishes the study of ethics from theoretical disciplines. Theoretical disciplines like metaphysics were cognitive and primarily concerned with the acquisition of intellectual virtue. On the other hand, practical disciplines concern themselves with human affairs. Aristotle viewed ethics as a practical discipline because it involved the cultivation of moral virtue through practice. What's important to notice here is that Aristotle doesn't think ethics can be cultivated simply through intellectual knowledge. It has to involve the practice or embodiment of certain practices. Aristotle began with a starting assumption which is now viewed as controversial. He argued that to be ethical, children had to be habituated into the good. The reason this is controversial is because for Aristotle, it wasn't possible to be habituated into the good as an adult if that hadn't already happened when you were a child. Contemporary psychologists would now argue that Aristotle didn't understand neuroplasticity and he didn't understand that people can change their habits. But the important takeaway here is that Aristotle is calling attention to the way in which practices shape us. And so for Aristotle, it was important for children to be shaped by ethical practices. Virtue ethics is a teleological system of ethics. Telos is the Greek word for aim or purpose. In virtue ethics, one wants to aim for the ultimate telos. The ultimate telos is the end or purpose for which there is no other end or purpose. It represents the end of all striving. So Aristotle defined the ultimate telos as eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is a Greek word which gets translated into English as happiness, but we have to be careful. Aristotle doesn't mean by that term happiness in the sense of feeling happy. What he means by eudaimonia is human flourishing. So in his virtue system of ethics, one wants to practice certain actions and habits that lead to the ultimate telos. And an action is morally justified if it leads to human flourishing. Let's delve a little more deeply into Aristotle's conception of happiness. We've already discussed the fact that he conceived of happiness as an ultimate or final end, but he also defined it as, quote, an activity of the soul in accordance with complete excellence or virtue. What Aristotle meant by this was that happiness is achieved when we perform certain actions with excellence. And when we perform those actions with excellence, they are considered to be virtues. For Aristotle, there were two types of virtue. There were the intellectual virtues, and these required Sophia, which is a Greek word for wisdom. But for Aristotle, Sophia is theoretical wisdom. The idea here is that one learns cognitively and then applies that knowledge to situations that one encounters in life. There are also moral virtues, and these require phronesis or practical wisdom. And this goes back to that idea that one has habituated into the good and then draws on that experience to make ethical judgments. What's important here is to note that intellectual virtues are based primarily on cognition, and moral virtues are based on habit. How does one cultivate moral excellence or the virtues? Aristotle argued that virtue could be understood as excellence or the mean, and he sometimes called it the golden mean, between two opposing vices. On the one hand, there was the vice of excess. On the other hand, there was the vice of deficiency. So the virtue was the balance or the golden mean between these two vices. Moral excellence is, quote, a mean between two vices, the one involving excess, the other deficiency. And that is such because its character is to aim at what is intermediate in passions and actions, end quote. But as you've probably already learned in life, it's not easy to find the balance and to live a balanced life. Aristotle put it this way, quote, it's no easy task to be good, for in everything it is no easy task to find the middle. That is why goodness is both rare and laudable and notable. What Aristotle is really highlighting is the fact that it's easy to go to extremes. It's easy to move to the extreme of excess. It's easy to move to the extreme of deficiency. What's difficult is striking the right balance to live in the middle, to live in the tension that doesn't fall into those two extremes. For Aristotle, that's why goodness was indeed rare and laudable and notable, simply because it's not easy for us to do as human beings. Finding the golden mean requires phronesis, and as we've already discussed, phronesis is practical reasoning that draws on experience to determine the proper course of action. This is why Aristotle emphasized early childhood experiences. He believed that those early experiences were formative and became the basis for making judgments in adulthood about the proper course of action. As we've already discussed, contemporary psychology recognizes the neuroplasticity of the brain and therefore the ability that we all have to make changes. So even if a person hasn't been habituated into the good as a child, it's still possible for them to make changes in their habits now. But this is not something that Aristotle would have recognized. Let's look at an example. Recall that for Aristotle, virtue is defined as excellence, the mean between two opposing vices. On the one hand, there's the vice of excess. On the other hand, there's a vice of deficiency. So let's think about what the virtue of courage would look like. On the one hand, it would avoid the vice of excess, the vice of recklessness. Recklessness is a lack of fear, and that lack of fear causes us to act in ways that are bold and brash and irresponsible. On the other hand, there's the vice of deficiency, which is cowardice. Cowardice is too much fear. And so cowardice causes us not to act. We're timid and we hold back and don't take the actions that we should. Courage represents that balance, the golden mean between these two vices of excess. Courage is not the lack of fear, and it's also not allowing fear to overtake us. It's acting in spite of our fears. I'm going to begin this part of the presentation by telling an old joke that's actually not terribly funny, and I suppose one should never begin a joke by saying it's not terribly funny, but it's not, but it does make a point. So there's a person in New York and they're lost and they're walking on the street and they stop someone, a stranger, and they say, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the response is practice, practice, practice. And that joke is important for us because for Aristotle, how does one become virtuous? Practice, practice, practice. The idea is that you become what you practice. And so if you want to become virtuous, you're going to have to practice certain actions over and over and over again until they become your disposition or your second nature. In other words, until you do them without thinking about it. The analogies he drew on were to musical instruments and sports. And so we all know that if you want to play piano well, you have to practice playing piano. And the idea is that you practice it so much and so often that when you sit down at the piano, you don't have to do a lot of thinking. Playing the piano is simply your second nature. And so for Aristotle, if we practiced certain actions until we attained excellence, we would achieve eudaimonia. Aristotle noted, quote, "A habit, friend, is of long practice born, and practice ends in fashioning man's nature," end quote. So again, the idea is that we become what we practice. So if we go back to that example of courage, if we want to attain the virtue of courage, we are going to have to practice being courageous. If we think that patience is a virtue, we're going to have to practice being patient until we can be patient, and it's just our second nature. We don't even have to think about it any longer. We began this presentation by suggesting that virtue theory could help us respond more effectively to some of the more painful aspects of the human condition. Virtue theory can actually help us avoid the pitfall of either or responses. When we're faced with suffering, trauma, or our own mortality or others' mortality, it's easy to fall into either the vice of excess, which is a naive optimism, or the vice of deficiency, which is cynicism or despair. The vice of excess or naive optimism might be defined as too much hope. It's somebody who glibly pushes past the negative aspects of life and simply says everything's going to be okay. It's just kind of a rosy disposition that doesn't take into account the reality of suffering. On the other hand, when faced with these same things, it's also easy to fall into cynicism or despair. And this might be defined as a lack of hope or not enough hope. The cynic says it's never going to get better. It's the sort of Eeyore response to life, if you're familiar with Winnie the Pooh, and it keeps us from engaging life more fully. The virtue between these two excesses is compassion. And one of the readings that you're going to do this week will talk about compassion as the cardinal virtue. And it's really maintaining that hope. It's a sober recognition that we can't simply gloss over the difficulties in life, but we also don't want to fall into despair or cynicism and say that we can do nothing. And so we'll talk about this more this week, but virtue theory can actually help us maintain that difficult tension. Virtue theory helps us cultivate habits that enable us to embrace our own suffering and thereby become the kind of people who can create, quote, a relational home that invites others to embrace and or struggle with their own suffering and finitude. One of the readings that you'll do this term is a book by Robert Stolorow, and he talks about the fact that in order for us to move past suffering and trauma, there needs to be a relational home that can hold our pain and suffering. So what we're suggesting is that virtue theory can help us cultivate the habits necessary to create that relational home. So in short, what we're suggesting is that virtue theory helps us become more human and therefore helps us respond to other people's humanity with more compassion and more hope.